has a unique chance to build forward better from the COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic has hit African countries especially hard. Before COVID, Africa was home to 6 of the world's fastest growing economies. Today, the pandemic has caused the first recession in 25 years for most African countries. It has shown how exposed Africa is to other disasters, including climate change. On the 6th of April, more than 30 heads of state and global leaders committed to priority actions to help African countries adapt to the impacts of climate change. They have rallied behind the bold, new Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. Its goal is to mobilize $25 billion to accelerate climate change adaptation actions across Africa. African leaders have agreed that climate resilience must be a key element of their economic recovery plans. Their goal is to integrate measures to address the twin threats of climate and COVID-19.
We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to build forward better from this COVID crisis. Nowhere is this more critical than in Africa, the continent on the front line of our climate emergency.
Africa needs global solidarity on climate change. Solidarity to boost Africa's resources and capacities to adapt to climate change. Solidarity with nations to secure themselves against catastrophic risk events and damage. Solidarity to support millions of farmers who face huge challenges to adapt to changes they did not cause.
To address the current health and economic crisis and the climate crisis, many countries in Africa will need support from the international community. This is critical for the region and for the wider world. For this reason, we are calling for a comprehensive approach that would include domestic and international measures.
I've asked all G7 members and other developed countries, as well as multilateral and national development banks, to increase the share of climate finance allocated to adaptation and resilience to at least 50% of their total climate finance. Today, adaptation and resilience finance accounts for a mere 20% of total climate finance flows.
In response to the African Union's Africa Adaptation Initiative, the African Development Bank and the Global Center on Adaptation jointly developed the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. It will help African countries scale up and speed up climate adaptation across Africa. African leaders are determined to strengthen the continent's capacity to adapt to climate change.
We have to insist that equal attention be paid to adaptation and mitigation in climate finance. Africa calls on the developed nations to shoulder your historic responsibility and to join the program to accelerate adaptation in Africa.
Nos échanges devraient se focaliser sur les actions d'adaptation aux impacts de changement climatique. Il s'agit notamment des solutions fondées sur la nature, la transition énergétique, le cadre de transparence renforcé, le transfert des technologies et les financements climatiques.
My administration is in the process of developing a long-term greenhouse gas emission strategy for 2050, and we aim to submit our strategy to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change before COP26 in Glasgow later this year.
There is broad agreement among African leaders and their development partners that Africa must develop based on a deep understanding of climate risks. Access to adequate finance is a challenge to achieving this. Globally, only 10% of global climate finance goes to adaptation, and just 19% of this comes to Africa. Developed countries are expected to provide $100 billion annually for climate finance, and a greater share of this should go to climate adaptation.
Together, I believe we can avoid the worst effects of climate change while helping billions of people adapt to our changing world.
The COVID crisis is a wake-up call that we are utterly unprepared for our next crisis, the climate emergency.
The African Adaptation Acceleration Program will build on what is working and speed up the actualization the African Adaptation Initiative of the African Union.